enhance forestry or international forestry at NC State University. So again, as I usually say, building on the community that we have, both of our students as well as our faculty and members that have experiences from different corners of the world. So this is our last chapter meeting for the semester since the semester ends this month. But as I mentioned, we do have a group walk either planned next Friday, which it is looking okay for weather-wise, or the rain date was the following Friday during our normal time. I did want to see where we wanted to go, thinking about different options for what's closest for everyone, whether we wanted to go to Pullen Park, so right off campus, or, you know, Lake Raleigh is on the other side, so Centennial, and then Dorothea Dix. So if you could just put in the chat your preferred location, or if it doesn't matter, that's fine. I'll send out a calendar and invite to everyone after this, so that way you have it and we can have a time to meet at one of these locations. And we do have, we're hoping we can have a little treat or something for you all to kind of commemorate the year. We're in the process of that, so stay tuned. What I wanted to finish up before I introduce our guest today is speaking about the seminar that the ISTF NC State Executive Committee hosted for the Yale ISTF conference in February. So we got some really amazing feedback. And so I wanted to share that and kind of the next steps for any of us that are interested in kind of participating in this type of group. So we had a kind of participatory design seminar where instead of us telling people what our group for diversity, equity, or inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility should look like for ISTF, we instead kind of asked and facilitated the conversation so that way our community, the organization as a whole for the ISTF Global, could supply us with what their wants and needs and concerns are. So we utilized the SWOT network, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for those that are unfamiliar, to kind of collect this type of opinionated or opinion response to help form a better framework to design this learning and working group. We also used a tool that Meredith Hovis had shared with us that she uses in her class for Poll Everywhere. So we were actually able to get anonymous responses from the members of for the participants of the seminar. So these, and this is a lot more words than I like to show, but this is kind of, I can save these slides and send them to you all if you're interested. This is what our responses were from the guests or from the participants. So obviously strength, as when you entered the conversation today, we're talking about how diverse and how much networking is a value to ISTF, as well as I'm going to go say with the opportunities. So we have kind of a strong foundation where we do have people that are involved in all different aspects of academia, research, international forestry as a whole, the practice, in all different locations, so where we could build really strong collaborations. On the, negative side, which I'm trying, that's kind of the only word I can think of for negative, but maybe where we need growth, we talk about being able to make sure we're actually attracting everyone, because typically, at these types of events, it's going to be more of those that are in higher academic standing, those that are involved in research, and maybe less that have their feet on the ground. And then threat kind of being with that, obviously NC State is in the US. So this was something that our leaders in ISTF, NC State were worried about, is that a lot of kind of forestry management decisions have been built on kind of privilege and being white. There's a lot of sometimes colonial sentiment to it, especially with trying to interject our thoughts and our strategies to more lesser developed nations. So this was something we really want to try to keep at the forefront of our mind, so that way we're making sure that this is not, one-sided, and that we're getting everyone's input, and everyone is involved in throughout the process. So the end result of what we're going to do is we're going to host a workshop in the fall of 2021 at NC State. We're hoping to have a hybrid workshop. And so the workshop that we had, the seminar at Yale, was pretty small, and that's because it was just online for at least the participation, and most of the individuals, like I had mentioned, kind of fell into this more higher privilege, white colonialism kind of stigma that forestry can have in international aspects, as well as they were highly educated. But we did have a diverse pool of disciplines for those that were involved in different aspects of tropical forestry. And ISTF Global asked us to share the results of our workshop with them, and also hold this type of event where we're actually using that poll everywhere to solicit information from each of the members at a larger scale. And so from there, that's where we'll kind of look into more, hopefully getting a larger participant pool to help kind of establish this framework for the group. That's what I'm going to call it, just because it's a mouthful for diversity. And then moving forward, what action plans we would like to have for the organization as a whole, as well as our chapters across the world. Okay, so for those of you, I got this from our one of the newsletters we get regularly to our email, but just so you know, there is an international festival, and it's actually next week. And it's going to be pretty much mostly digital, so doing a lot of like social media, but they are going to have an on-campus giveaway for international snack boxes. And I asked to have, because I entered ISTF for them to spotlight us, that plantains and mangoes, because they asked for kind of a cultural or themed snack that to go with your society. So obviously tried to think of something tropical, and that would be easy to get, but some kind of chips or something. And I also wanted to feature, and I don't think she's here, unfortunately, but that's okay. So Anna Kubis, she's one of our members. She's going to present through the FER department seminar that happens on Mondays. She's going to have a short presentation during that time, as well as all of the rest of the students. And then the next few, I think, classes. So I just wanted to spotlight her work in Peru that she's going to share with that group. And I also wanted to segue into our guest speaker. So we're extremely honored to have someone that has been working in the forest industry, as well as multiple aspects of the forest industry, for a significant period of time when a lot of changes have started. Not to age Scott, but to say that forestry is an ever-evolving process. And while he's sharing today, I would like for you all to kind of think and put in your mind what he's speaking about. How is it still relevant? Are these issues still can you still see them happening, especially in some of these tropical locations? Or, how is this going to, build upon our profession as a whole? So with that, I want to welcome Scott. And Scott, you can take the floor. And would you rather people kind of interject, or would you rather have questions at the end?
Let me make a basic presentation, Stephanie, and then we'll see what questions people have. And thank you very much. I graduated from NC State in 1960, way back in the dark ages. And so I've had a long affiliation with the school that I have thoroughly enjoyed. I also graduated from the Yale School of Forestry with a master's. So I have a link there too. My invitation today began when I sent Erin Sills some information about a group that I co-founded called the Forest Dialogue. We're celebrating 20 years of activity. I hadn't known Erin until about 5 years ago when we met, but we found out that incidentally, In the 1990s, when she was doing student intern work in Brazil, I was also going to Brazil quarterly because I was responsible for Westvaco Corporation's Brazilian subsidiary. And we knew a number of the same people in the conservation movement in Brazil. So she thought that, that the aspect of forest dialogue would be of interest to your group. And as I reflect on my experience, Stephanie, anytime you have discussions about forest plans or changes in forest use on any scale at all, anywhere in the world, you're going to have debate and discussions. That's just as true in Africa or Indonesia or South America as it is when you're modifying a forest management plan on a national forest in the United States. And you're going to have a lot of people with different objectives and different personalities involved in those discussions. And you either find ways to have those conversations productive without animosity, or they can quickly degenerate. So I think there's a lot that I'm going to discuss about the origin of the forest dialogue built around the context of the intense competition among the early initial forest certification systems, but that's really just a model for us to reflect on. In 1992, the UN had a conference in Rio on environment and development, and that brought a focus on the sustainability of forest. And the global NGOs had very high hopes that this was going to produce a real change in the programs and policies of the UN in affecting forestry around the world, but especially in the Southern Hemisphere where most of those were operating. But that didn't happen in Rio. So in 1993, the next year, the NGO, social and environmental, convened in Montreal and decided they were going to create their own market-based system to try to bring about the changes they hadn't been able to get from the policy arena. And so they created the this new Forest Stewardship Council forest certification system. And that was put together with almost everybody putting into the pot what they liked and didn't like in terms of forest. But coming out of that, planted forests were undesirable. Exotic plantations especially, that they were just taboo. Genetic manipulation of trees was taboo. Use of pesticides and herbicides was frowned upon. And with good reason in some respects, the labor unions were especially concerned about worker safety and wages and work rules. And when you saw some of the pictures of illegal logging in places like the Amazon or elsewhere, you saw barefoot workers with no safety equipment whatsoever working in the woods. And then the rights of indigenous people were another concern. So all of that was tossed into the pot. Well, the FSC then went below the equator to try to implement this system, and it got some pretty strong pushback. The basic message they got was, don't impose on us something you're not doing back home in Europe. Do it there first, and if it works, then come back and talk to us. So this refocused the FSC aggressively on Europe and North America to try to get that system going. About that same time in 1993, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development had commissioned the International Institute for Environment and Development in London to do a global analysis of the paper industry and its various effects, both manufacturing, but also embracing forest. And it created the WBCSD had been created so there would be a business entity in the Rio discussions. And it had continued after that, based in Geneva with a large number of larger corporations. Well, the IIED published a report called Towards a Sustainable Paper Cycle in 1996, and that was pretty widely disseminated. Now, stepping back a second to the United States, in the 1990s, was a lot of public concern about wide-scale clear cutting of forest here in the United States as mechanized logging was really taking off. And this was especially true on the national forest, but also on corporately owned forest. And most of you may be familiar that west of the Mississippi River in the United States, all surveying is done on the public land survey system, in which everything is divided into square mile blocks and subsections of that or multiples of that. So forest managers in the West tended to cut according to those boundaries. And so what you ended up with some very visible square clear cuts sitting on mountainsides that didn't look very appealing at all. Well, in 1994, the American Forest and Paper Association had created a steering committee to address those concerns, and I was asked to chair that committee. And we had senior forestry officials from all of the major pulp and paper forest products companies in the United States. Now, our own public surveys and focus groups had shown the public was mainly concerned about certain things. Number one, they didn't like big clear cuts and the way they looked. They were concerned about the effect of the timber cutting on the quality of water on the streams coming from the forest. They were concerned about what that was doing to wildlife habitat. And the term sustainability hadn't come into the public lexicon, but it was articulated in the sense, we're not sure that our grandchildren will be able to enjoy the same kind of forest that we have in our lives. And so the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI, emerged from that in 1995 as a forest industry commitment to address those specific concerns that had been identified by the public in the United States. And we also recognize that you don't want to include too many things or priorities get mixed. You pick a few things because you got to train an awful lot of people, foresters, loggers, other woods workers, and so forth. And you don't want them to get their priorities mixed up. So focus on the key things, which was different from the FSC that embraced almost everything. Well, the Canadians had some similar issues, and so they created the Canadian Forest Certification. It was modeled on the SFI. And now something else was happening in Europe, where you had large areas of individually owned forest. And in most of the European countries, you had landowner forestry associations that operated at the local or regional or national level. But the European Union was emerging as a wide area, more of a wide area government, and they recognized they were going to have to deal with that. So they had created the European Confederation of Forest Owners, bringing together all of the various national landowners, the Swedish, the Finnish, the Norwegian, the German, the French, the Luxembourg, or whatever. Well, when FSC arose, these European forest landowners were not going to let a bunch of NGOs based in Geneva tell them how to manage their forest. So they created the Pan-European Forest Certification, focused on addressing their systems of forest management. Now, I'd mentioned too that in the United States, we'd had the tree farm system since 1942. It was a little simpler system of certifying essentially forests that were committed to reforestation and good stand management, because it emerged in an era when reforestation wasn't always the situation following harvesting. So now you really had sort of a perfect storm. You had the FSC seeking to launch its system in Europe and North America at the same time that these other systems were coming into being. And the Brazilians weren't far behind with CERFLOR. In Chile, they had created CERFOR. And so the systems were proliferating. And the basic ideas across the private sector was that forest owners were not going to allow a bunch of NGOs who were unfamiliar with their practices dictate how they would practice forestry. Well, the Forest FSC immediately went on the attack. These were all competition, and they weren't used to doing things in a competitive way. The only tool they knew was to attack. the industry and the others responded somewhat. And you had ads in the press attacking the other systems and so forth. There were a lot of meetings that were held in different places around the world where people came together and they presented papers about their systems and why theirs was better than anyone else. And then the presenter sat down and someone else presented a paper saying, no, this is why my system is better. But there was no real dialogue. There was no discussion. There was no interaction among these parties. So now let's step back a second to the WBCSD. After the Rio conference, the WBCSD had created a sustainable forest products industry working group that was comprised of the liaison delegates from the companies from the forest products sector that belonged to WBCSD. And at the beginning, those companies were Aracruz from Brazil, one company each from Norway, Sweden, and Finland, two from Portugal. And after publication of the Sustainable Paper Cycle report, Westvaco, where I was responsible for forestry in our Brazilian subsidiary, International Paper Company and the Weyerhaeuser Company joined that. And SAPI from South Africa was a member. And over time, we added companies from Thailand, Indonesia, and Japan. But and there began to be some engagement between members of that working group and some of the NGOs, more on a small group or almost one-on-one level. But they were just very initial discussions. Now, about the same time, the World Bank comes into the picture. They were getting a lot of complaints about the effect of some of their big projects on dams and infrastructure on forest. And so Jim Wolfenson, the president of the World Bank, had contracted with WWF for 5 years to guide them on improving policies as they developed their projects. And Bruce Cabarly, who was with World Wildlife Fund, is the way they're known in the United States, was delegated to that role. And well, Wolfenson hosted some meetings among leaders and CEOs, among NGOs and companies, and he quickly found out there was no dialogue. They didn't know each other. There was no conversation among them. And the World Bank hosted a 2-day meeting of representatives of all of the identified forest certification systems from around the world to come and describe their systems and have a conversation. And during that discussion, I very well remember the remarks made by the representative from Gabon, who got up and said, look, for 2 centuries, white people from Europe came to Gabon and told us what to do. And we finally broke ourselves loose from that system. This forest certification system, FSC, sounds very much to us like white people from the north coming to Gabon to tell us what to do. And we think we are quite capable of defining what we need to do with our forest. That caught some attention, you know. I mean, that was a different perspective. I don't think a lot of FSC people had taken that into account. But Wolfenson asked that dialogue go forward, and the Sustainable Forest Products Paper Cycle report had recommended dialogue. So the WBCSD sponsored a dialogue, a facilitated dialogue in London in June of 1999 among representatives from companies and some NGOs. And the key recommendation that came from that dialogue was the need to create a mechanism for continuing dialogue among the various parties. And the professional facilitator, a Brit, who facilitated that dialogue, commented afterwards that he had never before facilitated a dialogue in which the opposing views were so strongly held and in which there was no willingness to seek compromise. So I was asked as a co-leader of the WBCSD working group to collaborate with Dr. Nigel Sizer at the World Resources Institute in Washington to create a dialogue group. Nigel and I hadn't met, but I was familiar with his work at WRI on Global Forest Watch. And earlier, Nigel had worked on a Smithsonian Institution project in the Amazon north of Manaus. And I was responsible for West Waco's Brazilian operation, and we had a corrugated container plant in Manaus where I went at least annually. So we at least had a touch point. In working together, we identified a potential steering committee as a vehicle for dialogue on forest issues. And the first meeting of that committee met in London in September of 1999, and it was hosted by Shell Natural Resources, meeting just a block away from the big wheel, the London Eye. And it included representatives from the WBCSD Working Group, from WWF, from World Resources Institute, a Woods Workers Union, other related parties. And this dialogue recommended the creation of an ongoing steering committee to plan and implement dialogues on various subjects of importance. And Nigel and I were asked to continue to lead that. Well, first thing we needed was a secretariat for the group. Up to that point, Nigel had been keeping the books on his own. And I was a graduate of Yale, and I was chairing its external advisory committee to its Global Institute of Sustainable Forestry. And Gus Speth was becoming dean of the college. Gus had been a founder of World Resources Institute, and he was just wrapping up a term as head of the UN's development program. And the Yale program was international. About half of the students in the Yale program were from outside of the United States. So Yale agreed to host the secretariat, and Gary Dunning, who was on the staff of the Institute, agreed to head the secretariat, and 20 years later, he still is. Well, the first order of business was for the members of the steering committee to continue a dialogue process. And this was partly so they could continue to develop relationships, but we also had to define what areas where was dialogue needed and what were the priorities. So we met in Sweden, where our host was Tage Klingberg. Tage was a business professor at the University in Gävle, up the east coast of Sweden, but he also owned a couple thousand acres of forest land, and was a past president of the Swedish Forest Owners Association. And we had a 2.5-day meeting on his property there. And we made a lot of progress in getting to know one another and identifying potential subjects for dialogue. But the key thing from that was you took this group of people who didn't really know each other well, and for 2.5 days, we ate 3 meals a day together. We had drinks together in the evening, and people began to really get to know each other and what motivated them, what they had in common. And as I give an example, there was a guy who headed the WWF Global Network, and he and I had clashed a few times in public meetings about the FSC. He was from Yorkshire in England, a forestry graduate of Oxford. He worked for 20 years for Shell Natural Resources in the tropics, and he was absolutely committed to the FSC. But that time together, socializing, we learned how much we had in common in terms of our education and motivations in getting into forestry. And the interesting thing over time is that 3 years later, he and I worked together hand in glove in planning a international forestry meeting in Atlanta. And that came about because, I mean, we still had differences of opinion on things, but it wasn't a fight. And that was the important thing about dialogue. So then I hosted a third meeting of the steering committee in Somerville, South Carolina at West Waco's Forest Sciences Laboratory. And we continued to make progress. And this is another example. At that meeting, I commented to Alexei Yaroshenko, who was on Greenpeace from the committee. He was with Greenpeace Russia. And I said, Alexei, I never hear you saying anything about all of this stuff we see on the Greenpeace websites, you know, about the FSC and your opposition to these things. And he said, look, he said, I work in Russia. 80% of the forest around me is being cut down illegally. Until I can do something about stopping that, I don't have a second to think about these other things. And so again, you learn, don't stereotype people based on who they work for or just what they are. Get to know them. And the first actual dialogue we had in response was logically on certification. And so we brought together the staff leaders and some key board members of each of the 5 systems in Geneva. And believe me, that was a rather tense session. These people had never been together before. They'd been campaigning against each other. And there we learned the value of facilitated dialogue, having a skilled, neutral facilitator who could keep a lid on things, see that everybody got to have something to say, and nobody ran off with the meeting. But the participants in that discussion came to realize that as they publicly denigrated each other's systems, we characterize it as throwing bombs in each other's castles. From the public, all it was doing was saying none of these certification systems are any good. Certification has no place. And the industry people pointed out that while their salespeople out there competing against each other nose to nose for customers, their representatives could also sit down in a trade association and work together on things. And that the participants recognized that the guys heading each of these systems had the same issues. How do you manage an array of supporters and people who have different agendas and different things? How do you manage a group? And so we facilitated dialogue, follow-up dialogues for them, just to sit down together and talk shop and figure out how do you manage these things. And you also learned, I remember a conversation with the German who at one point headed the FSC program. And I asked him, I said, how do you deal with all of these competing issues within FSC? Because you've got everything on the social and the conservation and all different kinds of viewpoints. And he said, well, I tell you what, he said, it's not easy. But he said, don't listen to what I say, just watch what I do. And that was important. A lot of times speaking, he had to speak to the universe, but then when he actually made operating decisions of what they were going to do, that was something different. That was a good insight. We held a second dialogue on forest certification later in Maidenhead, England. And that also included some of the companies that were requiring certification for their projects, the Procter & Gamble's of the world, if you will. And I remember at that, Nigel Sizer at that time had left WRI and was working for the Nature Conservancy in the Asia Pacific region. And Nigel made the comment, he said, look, all of you with your systems spend so much time debating the fine points and the nuances of your system. I'm working in Indonesia. It'll take us 15 years just to try to control illegal logging. If you all could come up with a common definition of what is legal logging, that would be the most helpful thing you could do for us. Forget about all of that other stuff. Right now, we can't do that other stuff until we can get it, but how do you define it? What does it embrace? And so that was sort of the way this thing got going. And a few months ago, the Forest Dialogue celebrated its 20th anniversary. And Stephanie, I've sent you information you can share with the group on where the website is and some of the things. But if you look at the evolution of the steering committee, so I note when it started, the steering committee had a couple of women. Otherwise, it was basically white people from the north, although some had worked in the tropical regions. And you had an American forest and a British biologist leading the steering committee. Today, you have got 2 women who are leading it, both Portuguese speakers. One is a Japanese Brazilian who is with a large Brazilian pulp and paper company. The other is a woman from Mozambique who works with the social and environmental groups. There are representatives on the steering committee from Africa and Asia, South America, about half women and half men. So it has grown to reflect the diversity of the kind of dialogues. And if I look at the things I've talked about, certification as being the initial focal point, but looking at some recent dialogues that they have had, the most recent one was on the Quilombo Valley landscape in Tanzania in 2019. And also in 2019 on the Mole ecological landscape in Ghana. And the Mangay landscape land use in the Democratic Republic of Congo, also in 2019, and on sustainable land use in Wassa Amenfi in Ghana in 2019. Field dialogue on tree plantations in the landscape in Chile. Considerations for REDD plus benefit sharing in Peru, and so on. You can look at them, but you get the point is that I want to come back to my opening point. Everyone participating in this meeting in your career is going to be involved in dialogue one way or another related to forest. If you go to school on what the forest dialogue has done, then there's a lot that you can learn to ensure that those processes are really productive and useful and lead to some good results. And with that, I'll conclude, and let's see what questions or comments or observations people have.
Thank you, Scott. That's it was very you know, as you were yeah, please, everyone's giving you hand applause if you see that. Thank you. That was for I think for us, you know, we see certification now, many of us, and what it's become, and it's fascinating to think that, you know, we think of, particularly, we usually just think of the three big systems. Obviously Europe has theirs. So when I say three big systems, using SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, ATF, American Tree Farm, and then as well as FSC, so First Stewardship Council. And then I know that Europe, I think, has PEFC or something like that.
Yeah, PEFC, pan-European. It's interesting there, that was originally a European system, and then it evolved into an umbrella certification system. So the SFI and the American Tree Farm system are now certified by the PEFC, as are many other certification systems around the world. So you really have a couple of large systems. The FSC and the PEFC are the two large umbrellas.
Yes, and it's for me, it's hard to think that when it's such a large system that, you know, that they're able to resolve some of the issues that they were facing in the beginning, that landowners were resistant to these standards, because I would assume they were developed kind of without their input. And say, I wanted to know, you know, now if you know, like, or if you can speak to how has that evolved to be, is that still a difficult process with trying to get landowners to agree to some of these standards, particularly when they're developed in a different area, or is there much more landowner input to where they'd be less hesitant to take on these opportunities?
Stephanie, I think the systems have logically evolved, and FSC has had to evolve the application of its systems. They may have an umbrella set of standards, but it recognizes that there is a very different challenge in applying those standards to a redwood forest in California, or southern pine plantation, or to a native forest in somewhere in Africa, or dealing with a eucalyptus planted forest in Brazil, for example. And the SFI, which began as something sponsored by the American Forest and Paper Association, was spun out into its own entity, and it operates independently now, pulls its own board members, has a much broader funding base, and its standards are designed to be applicable to what's in the United States. But the PEFC continues to certify a Swedish forest standard or a Luxembourg forest standard or a German forest standard, each of those focused on what is relevant in the social and economic and the historical forestry context, because the historical is important. It defines very much what the land use patterns are, the size of forest properties, who owns them. And again, you can't take one blanket standard and try to make everything adhere to it.
That's no, and it's also very interesting that the pulp and paper industry was so instrumental in this. You know, obviously it's interesting to think about this coalition of private entities, landowner representatives, as well as NGOs. But it's inspirational to think that, hey, if they could all get on the same page at one point, then we can maintain this. I saw Rajan has his hand up, so I was going to pass it over to him.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Scott. It's really interesting to know the history and how this forest certification concept evolved over the years. Yeah, some of the concern, not a little bit of thoughts on is pretty much like, if you see, we have like 3 major systems and it's going well, but when I see the data, mostly in the US South, right? So we have just 20% of our forest lands are being certified under the 3 systems. I think that is around 20-25%. So I'm just wondering why is so low? Why don't see much of our lands under this certification system? And since I work in the extension side, and I was presenting in one of the landowners workshops in Eastern North Carolina, and one of the landowners was pretty furious at the system. Pretty much what he was mentioning is he is feeling that somebody from Europe or somewhere else is trying to dictate on him what he can do or cannot do on his property. Some of the landowners, I mean, they have that kind of impression as well about this kind of the sustainability systems and the forest certification system, right? So, but it's still, when you see the certification rate, it's still low, particularly in the US South. So, why is so, and what is your take on that?
That's mainly, I think, a reflection of the land ownership pattern, where you have a certain number of large properties formerly owned by the industry, now by TMOs, and you have some individuals who have accumulated pretty large areas of land, and so they see themselves as active forest managers. But what we have found in survey after survey and studies through the years of dealing with the small landowner problem, you've got a lot of small owners who own some land that happens to be forested, and it may be a forested portion of a larger ownership, or it may be someone who inherited or bought a 10-acre forest, and they don't think of themselves as a forest owner. They think, I own some woods, but they don't think of themselves. I mean, it's not just a challenge of certification, it's how do you get those people to manage their forest at all? And this has been a challenge for us in the South as long as I've been in forestry, and will continue to be. The consulting foresters tend to work for larger landowners who can afford to pay their fees. You have state agency foresters who are involved in landowner assistance, and they tend to work with a group, and I don't mean in a formal sense, but a group of owners who have enough forest land, they're interested in managing it, they're interested in knowing about management techniques, they want to know how to sell their timber appropriately, how to reforest their land. But that still just leaves out huge numbers of owners, and the ownership cycle for many of them is short. But one of the the Pinchot Institute for Conservation did a study years ago in which they interviewed large numbers of children who were the children of people who had been identified as children who had whose parents owned forest. And they interviewed the parents and they interviewed the children separately. Many of the parents planned on leaving the forest to the children. The children had no idea that the parents were going to leave the forest to them. They had no involvement in managing the forest. They had no plans for owning and managing a forest. So when they inherited it, that they were going to be complete neophytes in the whole arena. That is the problem now. In Europe, because you've got the forest owner associations well established, and most forest owners are members of those associations, because in Europe they do things that in the United States legally they're not allowed to do. The associations can get together and they can take bids to buy seedlings together, to buy seed or fertilizers or other supplies together. The foresters for those associations market their timber to the industry as an association. So you might have what is the equivalent of a 2-county association, and all of those owners negotiate as a group with the paper companies to see who is going to buy their wood. Whereas in the United States, you don't have that. So you don't have any structured sense to make that sort of thing happen. But in terms of attitude, I remember Tage Klingberg coming and talking to a group of foresters in Georgia. He could have been a Georgia forester in terms of his attitude about forestry and the government.
Thank you. And I see Aaron also has a hand
Aaron
up.
has joined us.
Yes.
Hi, Scott.
Hello, Aaron.
Thanks for a great talk. I joined quite late, but I'm going to go back and listen to the recording, which I know Steph will share with us. So hopefully this isn't redundant with what you already said that I missed, but I wanted to ask a version of Rajan's question focused on the tropics.
Yeah.
Because it's also true that a very tiny portion of natural tropical forests has come under any certification system. One possible interpretation of that is that the most likely way for certification to affect sort of tropical forests on a large scale and have a real impact on biodiversity and carbon and sort of the global public goods we care about is if certification systems affect government policy, right? So we're looking for that spillover from certification systems to governments. So I wanted to get your perspective on that from the Forest Dialogue's perspective. What have you seen work well in terms of facilitating that transfer of lessons and ideas from a private sector initiative like certification into the public sector, into government systems, or does it not work?
Aaron, I'm not sure because a lot of work in that arena has occurred since I retired. It might be better to pose a question like that to Gary Dunning, who heads the Secretariat for the Forest Dialogue. But my sense is that my experience in that is more, of course, is related to Brazil. But if you look at something like the Amazon, first of all, if you're certifying it, who owns it? And what are you certifying and who controls it? Who can implement the decisions that you're making? And a lot of it involves dealing with government agencies. They're probably not that interested in applying standards like that, although it's interesting to see what's happened in Brazil with this new coalition of NGOs and businesses, both global businesses that are in Brazil, who are trying to bring about much more focus on that. The other depends on the scale at which you're working things. While I was working out of New York's, Westvaco's New York office, I served on an external advisory committee at the New York Botanical Garden, and I attended a lot of sessions. They did a lot of work in Indonesia, and they were totally surprised to find in one area that what they thought was a natural forest was completely managed by very local people. Now, this was a local forest, but it was almost down to individual families were responsible for groups of trees within that forest. And what they thought was a totally virgin natural forest was actually a tree by tree managed forest. But the question becomes then, how do you apply a certification system to certify a management system working on that way versus the way you apply it to a company managing loblolly pine plantations or eucalyptus plantations in Brazil versus a group managing a natural forested area somewhere in tropical Africa. The systems are so totally different. And I think that has partly been the difficulty is you can have a long list of things that you would like to see done, but how do you excerpt from that things that are actually relevant on the ground to the history of that area and to the culture of the people and the economy in which they operate? I went through the Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program, and we operated in groups that they called can mates, where two people shared a bathroom. And my can mate was from Malaysia and had been the manager of a state-owned forest operation in Borneo. And it was interesting talking to him where he had been trying to apply management systems in Borneo. And a lot of their knowledge came out earlier of managing rubber plantations. So that they were on a learning curve trying to figure out how to go beyond that. And of course, Borneo's got a whole set of issues beyond that. But I think that was perhaps to me the most frustrating thing about the FSC was trying to create. I characterize the FSC, you might be familiar, when Brazil went from the military government and wrote the new Brazilian constitution. It was sort of the business people sat down and wrote the economic sectors, and the labor unions wrote the labor sectors, and other people wrote other sectors, and it ended up being a hodgepodge rather than a coherent document. And the FSC, I think, has been on a 20-year learning curve, and they progress. There's no question about that.
Makes me wonder if that learning curve is necessary, right? I can't imagine a better place to start than each chamber sort of writing its own rules and then figuring out over time how to adjust those. Yeah, which means it's inevitably a long process, perhaps is the conclusion I'm going to draw from your comment there.
Well, it's a long process. And I mean, again, the SFI, which was developed to work within the economy and culture of the United States, still had to find ways to adapt itself to very different situations, whether you are managing coastal plain and Piedmont forest that run heavily to manage pine plantation versus managing Appalachian hardwood forest versus managing coastal forest in the West or redwood forest or Rocky Mountain forest. It's had to do a lot of adaptation just to different climates, different cultures, different markets, species, and ownership patterns. And so one size doesn't fit all there.
Well,
but at least these groups go back periodically every 3 or 4 years and revise their update their standards, and they do that partly reflecting on what's worked and what hasn't worked and what isn't being addressed. But it's a forest wide and different, and it's very hard defining systems any more than you got a single silvicultural system.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. I just wanted to say again, thank you, Scott, for sharing with us today. Shared your I put your email in the chat. I hope that's okay in case anyone wanted to send any more or have any other questions, they can email you or just stay in contact.
Sure. And Marion,
and,
thank you for setting this up. I
Yes.
appreciate the opportunity to participate with this group.
And we appreciate you joining us. So I'm glad it worked out. You've got deep historical knowledge, so it's really
Yes.
fun to hear.
But well, that comes from living a few decades.
It's true. It's nice though, because I think each of us are very much, there's not as much discussion on how things have evolved over time, and now we're very much concerned with here and now and then the future, where I think more discussions about how things have evolved, and we'd realize that a lot of the issues that we're facing we've already faced in the past, or we've already someone, unfortunately, now with globalization we're very much more connected, and I think these conversations sometimes can be easier for those of us that have the access, but obviously when you're looking into global scope, that still not everyone has access at the local level, and so it's still interesting to think, okay, can we learn anything, like how these are things that we still face every day, and how can we move forward with the knowledge that we have. It's just we need to be able to network and communicate and learn from each other.
Well, that's the key. That's the key thing, Stephanie, is that when it comes to dealing with a forest in a broader social and economic context, each of us thinks we know something, and we do, but we don't know it all, and we don't all have the breadth of perspective and understanding. And if you pull a diverse group, and I mean diverse in the sense of background, perspective, and interest, and they actually talk to each other, then they start learning from each other, and you get an awful lot of, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And until all of that comes out, you can't then begin to say, well, now we begin to sort of sense what the whole puzzle is that we're trying to solve. But until all of the pieces on the table, you can't solve that puzzle. And too often it was foresters trained in forestry school trying to sit down and deal with a public that could care less about the silviculture of yellow poplar or loblolly pine. I'm interested in kayaking and canoeing or hiking on the Appalachian Trail. And what you're telling me about all of that is totally irrelevant to what I'm interested in. And until you can have a common understanding and say, well, unless this forest is well managed to some standard, none of us are going to have any benefit from it. So let's start talking as a group what we need to do to hit on all of these things. But that doesn't come about until a group really gets to know each other and puts their prejudices aside and says, I'm willing to listen to you and help solve your problem. And I remember during the 7th World Forest Congress that was held back in Washington, and that was a dialogue process with people sitting around smaller tables. And there was a lady from Arizona, and she was with one of the more radical environmental organizations. And every time there was a break, they would go outside and caucus. And one day she didn't go outside and caucus. And she told us when we sat down, she said, my group is really mad at me because I didn't put them. But she said, this is fascinating. I'm learning things here I never knew. And that's sort of sense she was sort of, we're all indoctrinated to a sense in whatever arena we work in. And she was hearing sides of things that she'd never heard before. And she said, boy, this has opened my eyes. And so that was an early dialogue experience.
Yeah, that's.
Well, I got to let you wrap up, but
no, you're good. That's I wish on Fridays, especially, if we could talk pretty much all day.
Yeah, but I'm keeping you all from your weekend.
That's yes, those of us that don't still have work to do.
Got a few more Zoom meetings before the weekend comes.
Right.
But it's getting closer. It's getting closer. Well, again, thank you for taking your time to share with us today, and we look forward to being able to stay in contact and hopefully kind of see how this conversation continues.
Well, if I can help with anything on a follow-up, Stephanie, don't hesitate to call me and or contact me. And please give my regards to Fred Covich and some of the others up there who are legacies.
I
from
will. He
our association with
unfortunately,
the school.
yeah, I said, well, it's good. Fred's on vacation this week to see his family. So it's nice that, yeah, obviously he's getting time, but I was like, oh gosh, I wish I would have known that because I'm sure he would have really much enjoyed this. That's
Well, I'm a
okay.
product of NC State with George Slocum and Ralph Bryant, Burner Bryant as we knew him. And if you were on a field trip with Doc Bryant and talking about prescribed burning, he was just as apt to say, well, let's see how this woods burns, and pulls out a pack of matches. And we all stood around while he lit a fire and we just watched.
Things are done a little differently these days.
But it did, then we all stopped to know.
That's great. Well, thank you again, everyone. Have a safe and good weekend. And if the executive committee can stick around just for a second, I just wanted to confirm on our walk next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to meet
I'll
you,
leave.
Scott.
Bye-bye.
Bye.